Welcome to the New Business Community Law Clinic's third Friday training on legal issues for entrepreneurs. We tell you what you need to know. Many times people cannot afford legal help. So today we are actually going to go through our most ambitious legal workshop called Legal Checklist for Entrepreneurs. This is what a lawyer would tell you if you could afford $375 an hour. We're going to tell it to you in about 30 minutes here. My colleague, Kevin Chu, and I will go through and also give you a little acronym to remember, kind of a checklist, an acronym for what you need to take care of to get over those first couple of years of challenge for a new entrepreneur, which, by the way, claims about 50% of businesses every 5 years. So this will give you a leg up, help you become a more survivable business, and get you out on the road doing what you want to do. So thank you. So Kevin will jump in a few minutes, but I'll get started here. Okay. First thing to think about is we think of starting a business in kind of a different way than a number of people do. A number of people think of it as sort of romanticized. Oh, you can just start a business. Oh, if it doesn't go well, then you can just start it again. Well, it may not feel like that when you get started. It may feel a little bit more like this.
This navigation system's all messed up. I think we're in a park. Oh my God, it is a park! Away from the kids!
So yes, it's a very harrowing time when you're starting a business. A lot of things to learn, a lot of ways you can get into trouble. But what we're going to do is try and give you a sense of how to get behind the wheel of this new business, strapped in, ready to go. We have this nice little acronym for you to remember that gives you a sense of the different legal challenges you need to get over in those first couple of years here. So just to preview: business modeling, entity formation, capitalization, operational relationships to help you do your business, workers, suppliers, things like that, managing risks, and then those extra permits and licenses that you might need to do what you need to do, like a food business or something like that. We've broken this all into a very nice little acronym for you. Become. We want you to become a survivor, one of those entrepreneurs who is still there after 5 years. Okay? So let's start. Business modeling. If you take a look at this, this would be your business model if you were trying to visit all of the national parks. Well, if you think to yourself, that's a good introduction to what a business model is, but it's a little more than a map. It is, in many ways, your ability to take into account the different components of a business that have to fit together to make it run. And a good place to get a good grounding in that is this nice little book called Business Model Generation by Osterwalder and Pinheiro. This also introduces to you what's called the business model canvas. And we'll go through that in just a second, but what I point out to you is that internally you should be thinking about doing this kind of analysis for yourself before anybody asks you for what your business model or your business plan might look like. A bank might ask you for a business plan to give you a loan, something like that. But it's very important to do this before you even need to take your business on the road like that, because it helps you think about spotting issues, organizing your thinking, who are different partners you need to bring in to do the business. That's where this business model canvas is very helpful for you. Now, what I'd say to you is this is developed, used in a lot of different business schools, and the different segments of this that need to fit together. So let me give you an example of that. Here is business model canvas for Southwest Airlines, right? So what you think about is, the first thing is your value proposition. Value proposition for Southwest Airlines, of course, cheap flights, no frills, but also very friendly, can-do kinds of arrangements with your staff and stuff over the web or at the ticket counter, things like that. So you want to think about not only what is your value proposition, but how are you going to deliver it to the customer, okay? So you think about who are the customers that you want to bring into this business, what kinds of relationships you want to have with them, more of just a, on the web kind of, we schedule your flight for you, that sort of thing. But they also have this thing where they want you to feel like they're sort of taking care of you on the flight. You've seen those commercials and stuff. So they have both channels of interacting with their customers in person and on the web. All right, so then you start thinking about what activities you're going to be doing, and also the resources that you have to bring to that equation there. You know, one thing they do, Southwest, is they have this great fleet of 737s, not the bad kind, but the 737s that are sort of workhorse planes that are easy to maintain, things like that. That's one of their key assets. Their branding. You remember that heart thing that they always do in their commercials there? People start knowing about them because of their branding. Well, that's an asset that is very helpful. Good maintenance staff to know the 737s there. But then, that's not all. What they also need are some partners. You know, airports that are willing to do the Southwest flights coming through, like Atlanta and Phoenix. Those are their sort of hub airports there. They need to make arrangements with those partners on an ongoing basis. They give back, they give and take on those things. And then, of course, you got your cost structures, your revenue, and your costs there. But now, why is this important? Okay, well, think about if you had done this for your business here, already emerging from this are some potential legal issues, okay? Like, for example, partners. You need some contracts to set up that kind of a relationship. You're thinking about hiring and training staff. Well, there's some employment law issues. You got to know the difference between employees and independent contractors, stuff like that. Branding, as I said, you know, you got to think about protecting your trademarks or your copyrighted material or stuff like that. So if you're doing something like this, this will help you spot issues, but it will also help your attorneys, your consultants, other people who are helping you do the business help you. So an important first step is the business model, okay? Now you have to think about E, entity formation. You're going to take that business model and you're going to take it on the road, okay? It's a lot like picking out a car to get you on the road. So let's see what your options are here. You know the options generally maybe sole proprietorship, partnership, corporations, and also limited liability companies here. But probably the key thing to know about this is that if you don't choose one of these entities here, the law will presume an entity for you. It will assume that if you don't form something, you're going to be one of these two entities here, okay? And the problem with that is that neither of these are what we call limited liability entities. I'll explain that more in a minute, but limited liability separates you from the business so that then when people are suing, they aren't suing you, getting personal assets, your house, your car, your college fund. Instead, they're suing the business there. So you might want to create that kind of separation, especially if you're doing something risky. Okay, well, here are the questions. What's not an important question in entity is what's the easiest, what's the cheapest, what's the least amount of paperwork? Well, each of these entities is relatively easy to keep up and form. You can form any of these entities for less than $100 or less. Okay, so probably the most important thing is to think of these 4 questions when you think about your entity here. Okay, so let's take a look at these. Governance. Okay, challenge here is, are you going to be sharing decisions with others? And do you need some kind of formal structure for making those decisions, like with a board of directors or something? Investors often like to see boards of investors because it has sort of a group of people who are looking out for the business on a regular basis, and then some people doing it on the day-to-day basis, you know, managing the business and all that. And so it creates this structure that is easy to control. For example, if you get a majority of the board, then you can control that kind of entity. Investor-friendly likes, you know, they like a little bit more formalities. But I would say that new businesses often need a little bit more flexibility. So they might be more like a partnership where people share decision-making power. No one person is sort of controlling everything. Okay? So think about who and how you're going to be sharing decisions with other people. Tax, this is an important part. Taxes, your choices are, will your entity itself pay tax? Or will it be more of what we call a pass-through entity so that the profits flow directly into the pockets of the owners, okay? Whereas if the entity itself is the taxpayer, okay, in that situation, the entity itself takes losses or tax benefits, but not the individual owners. The individual owners might get profit shares, dividends when they are declared by the board. But then, as I said, tax issues, these things, we can't really advise you on this because it's very individualized. You want to talk with your accountant about which structure would work best for you. I will tell you though that the pass-through structure often is advantageous in the first 2 years because in that situation, losses also pass through so that you can use those losses to offset other income that you might have. Whereas if you have an entity level kind of taxation, then the losses stay in the entity. There's no way that the individual owners can benefit. Okay. Liability. Here's that thing I was talking about. You want to create separation between yourself and the business if you're doing anything risky. And I will tell you that in the 10 years we've been doing this here, I think we've only formed maybe 2 entities that weren't limited liability. One of them was a bow tie company. We couldn't figure out how a bow tie could kill anybody. And so they were okay with getting a limited liability entity. I think the other was a used bookstore that maybe a bookshelf could fall on somebody. But anyway, other than those 2, limited liability is probably a good thing for you to be thinking about. Now, the issue with that is you have to pay for it. In the state of California, it costs $800 at least every year, a minimum franchise tax that you have to pay to be one of these limited liability entities, a corporation or an LLC. Okay, finally, capital. Okay, key question here is, what is the kind of capital you're going to be expecting in the next couple of years? If you're looking for something called venture capital, that means people who don't really care what your business is about. They just want to see profits. They want to see 10-fold profits, 20-fold profits from you. And they're just investing in a whole bunch of different companies and such. Okay, those folks want to see a certain kind of entity. They also want to see you formed in Delaware instead of the state of California. It's a more expensive structure to set up. It has more formalities to it. We'll explain where to form in just a few minutes there. But if you're not seeking that kind of venture capital, you're seeking more local, maybe angel investors who care about what you're doing, then a California structure is going to work just fine for you. Okay, well, breaking into the different entity options here, you see we got these 4 factors on each of these here. And if you're here with us here, we have a nice chart that shows you all of the different entity options and how to form those options here. So, as I said, the corporation, the LLC, and the sole proprietorship or the partnership, as you can see, there's aspects of each of these that you should take a look at. Maybe in, you can freeze this frame and take a look and see what kinds of benefits or advantages or disadvantages of each of these kinds of entities. The other thing I would show you is these less common entities, but still ones you might consider. This first one is actually one that's a little bit new, and that is that your entity itself could have a social mission to it. Social mission meaning, helping save the planet or doing things for your workers or stuff like that in addition to generating wealth. Okay, well, if you set it up that way at the beginning, having this social mission in your formative documents, then you can protect yourself, meaning a shareholder who's mostly concerned with wealth is also going to be on board, because it's in formative documents, with your social mission. Okay. Another one to think about is an S corporation. We think of S corporations as pass-through entities where the profits go through to the owners directly. But it also gives you that limited liability shield, okay, going forward. Now we think of the S Corp as a little bit fragile because it has so many requirements that go with it. You gotta just be careful with, check with your accountant on this kind of thing. Remember that for a S corporation, shareholders have to be human beings, not organizations or companies. They have to have legal status in the US. You can have only 100 shareholders. You can only have 1 class of stock. So these are some requirements of the S Corp, but it does give you that pass-through status with a limited liability sheet. An LLC will actually do that for you as well, which you'll see on the previous slide there. Another thing is cooperatives. The main thing to think about with cooperatives is that you have investors, but they all are involved in business, generally all are involved in business. The workers own the company so that there's very little passive investment in there. Often democratic principles govern the decision-making in an arrangement like that. Okay, so think about these options for you. Last thing to think about is where to form. As I said, if you are looking at venture capital with strangers who want to see high profits, they also want you to form in Delaware. But if you're in California, you'd also be operating in California. So what this sets up for you, unfortunately, is kind of an expensive structure because you have to be paying taxes in Delaware and taxes in California. However, it does create a structure that is very investor friendly. These again would be big investors, not like the local person who just wants, philanthropist who likes your business model and is not looking for a big for-profit upside. So here's some benefits and disadvantages. But again, forming in Delaware, operating in California means that you are responsible for 2 states' laws, and lawyers, you probably need a lawyer to help you manage that kind of arrangement. Okay, that's entities, that's business modeling. Let's take you over to Kevin here, who's going to tell you about how to get gas in this new entity there, capital.
Thanks, Bill. So yes, as Bill mentioned, capitalization refers to the fuel that you're adding to your vehicle to get you to your destination. First up, we have this typical timeline that companies undergo in terms of the type of entity that they are versus the type of capital that they want to raise. And the thing that we want to highlight in this slide is that you can notice that here, closer to time equals 0, it's generally more flexible about the type of entity you are in terms of whether you can accept that type of investment and whether those particular investors or capital providers are willing to provide you with those funds. And so early on, it probably doesn't matter too much what type of entity you are, as long as you're raising money from people who know you very intimately. But as you get more into what we might refer to as stranger capital, capital that come from providers who didn't raise you from birth, they typically want the types of hierarchical controls that Bill mentioned in the corporate side of things, where it's a bit less personalized when it comes to that type of relationship. And so as you raise venture capital, as you want to become a public corporation, certainly, you'll probably either convert your existing entity into a corporation or form the corporation from the beginning. Next up, we want to run through the 3 of the avenues that you might have to raise capital from these various sources. First up, we have traditional securities. This refers to selling pieces of your company to others so that those other people will have an ownership share of the company itself. This could be shares of stock within your corporation. It could be membership units within an LLC. It could be ownership percentages of a partnership. And kind of the bottom line is that when it comes to state and federal securities regulators, well, they highly regulate this space. Typically, in order to even be allowed to sell, even trying to offer to sell these pieces of ownership of your company, you would need to be a publicly traded corporation. If you're listed on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, and the mountain of paperwork that goes along with those, or you would find some kind of exemption that would allow you to tell the SEC or the state securities regulators that no, the people who you want to sell pieces of your company to, they are of the type that shouldn't be under the protection that the SEC and the state regulators provide. And typically that would be aimed at the accredited investors, people who have very high net worth. And by accredited investors, I would mean people who have made at least $250,000 per year for the last 3 years, or $350,000 if they're married, or have a net worth of more than $1 million, excluding the value of the primary residence. This class of people, it's typically easier to find an exemption for, and you certainly want to talk with a securities attorney to be able to analyze your facts for each particular transaction that you might have with a prospective investor. Next up, we have the Kickstarter type of capital raising, and this would refer to essentially pre-sales of goods or services that you will provide in the future. And this actually wouldn't be considered a security or a sale of securities because you're not selling pieces of your company. You're selling an actual tangible good or product or future service that you're going to provide. So in that way, it wouldn't fall under the guise of this SEC and state securities regulators. And so you wouldn't have to go through the arduous process of finding an exemption or listing publicly. But you might still have certainly contractual obligations to follow. If you're promising these people who are making these pre-orders of a certain good, you would be in breach of contract if you don't actually follow through. And then third, we have the equity-based crowdfunding. And this would also entail, similarly to the first option, a sale of a piece of ownership of your company. But the nice thing is that the requirement is that you have to go through a registered crowdfunding portal that FINRA, our financial regulator, controls in order to ensure that each of the users who are on these crowdfunding portals, people who might not fit the definition of accredited investors, so long as they don't exceed certain thresholds in terms of percentage of their income, in terms of the amount your company is trying to raise per year. These crowdfunding portals will take care of the logistics of managing the level of investment that these users provide. And so in terms of compare and contrast, when it comes to traditional securities, your company is generally looking to raise a large amount of money from a very few number of individuals, whereas in equity-based crowdfunding, the goal is probably to raise a smaller amount of total funding from a larger pool of investors. But still, you have to go through a registered crowdfunding portal who would take care of that for you. Next up, we have these operational relationships. This analogy, this would be the other people in the vehicle with you. There are a number of relationships that you have to juggle as an entrepreneur, maybe with your capital providers, these investors who are helping to fuel your business, with your workers, the people who are in the trenches with you, providing the goods and services, your suppliers, distributors, people who are providing ancillary services or the essential materials or ingredients, the raw material for your business, and finally consumers. In a case of a one and done transaction, when you sell a product to someone else and they give you $1, probably not really a situation where you'd have an extensive contract governing that arrangement. But if this is a customer who you need to provide thousands of dollars worth of product to on a recurring basis, you probably do want to have some kind of written agreement showing each of those terms. And for each of these relationships, we want you to know what is required by the government in order to really actually set up that relationship. What would be our minimal recommendation of how to set up this relationship in a sustainable manner, and then finally what would be our optimal best practices for each of these relationships. But for this presentation, we're going to focus on the workers aspect, because this is the portion where entrepreneurs can get into a lot of trouble really quickly. And in terms of how the government regulates these various categories within the worker context, first up we have this employee bucket. The government has these categories of employee, independent contractor, or volunteer, or intern, and they will classify any given worker within your company as one of these buckets. And you as the employer, you have the burden to show that a particular worker is not an employee, because the presumption is that all of your workers are employees. And the difficulty with that is that employees are just very highly regulated. For those listening here, we do have a 17-point checklist that employers would have to satisfy in order to ensure that you don't get hit with fines or penalties for worker misclassification. And generally the logistics involved, based on logistics involved, we recommend going through a payroll service to really handle all the calendaring and deadlines in terms of reporting requirements. The independent contractor classification, this is often a route that many companies want to pursue because the cost structure is generally such that an independent contractor is going to require less funds than an employee. At the same time, we have had a bit of a shakeup in terms of the landscape of employment law here in California when it comes to demonstrating that a particular worker is in fact a contractor and not an employee. Here we see the ABC test, and the first prong of that test is that it's kind of a rehash of the traditional rule where the employer doesn't exert very much control over the contractor when it comes to the manner and means in which the work is performed. Generally, this means that the contract would be on a project basis. The money attached to that contract would be based on the results delivered and not really so much about the methods of how they perform the work. So that's probably something you're already doing. Prong B is a bit trickier in that in order to show that that worker is a contractor and not an employee, the employer would have to demonstrate that the type of service that the worker is performing is outside of the regular or continuous work of the business. And the classic example the court gives is that of a plumber being called in to work at fix the leaky sink at a retail clothing store. In this type of situation, a customer of that clothing store wouldn't think that that plumber is some in-house employee of that retail clothing shop. It's not a situation where it's a regular continuous presence within that clothing shop, and it's not a type of service that the retail clothing shop markets itself as the business of doing. Forever 21 doesn't advertise that they have the cleanest, most leak-free bathrooms. And so that is some way to show that this is not part of the regular continuous service of the business. However, you can imagine many gray areas for other types of service providers. And then finally, the third problem of the ABC test is that the contractor must have an independently established business doing that type of service. And so ways an employer could demonstrate that is through business cards from that contractor with their own personal website or business phone line, some advertising or marketing activity from that contractor trying to drum up other clients, just to show that this contractor isn't a contractor just for purposes of providing service to your one business, but in fact they have other clients, or at least they're trying to get other clients. And one thing that we want to highlight here is that in the intellectual property context that we'll be talking about in a few slides, the default case within the employment context, within employees, is that any of the intellectual property that they create, whether it's copyright, patent, trademarks, those would be owned by the employer by default. However, this is not the case for independent contractors. And so in order to make sure that you as the employer actually own all of the intellectual property the independent contractor creates, that has to be written in a written agreement with an assignment clause, which we have examples for here. And then finally, we have this category of volunteers and interns. Generally within the nonprofit space, volunteers are okay. Within the for-profit space, not so much. The Department of Labor guidelines stipulate that the intern, this unpaid intern who is working in some capacity for the for-profit, they should be the primary beneficiary of that relationship. And the experience really should be somewhat very similar to what the kind of training that they get at an education institution. And generally that's a task that most for-profit companies probably aren't best suited to, at least in the early stages. And so in the end, interns tend to be more trouble than they're worth. And then I want to hand it over to Bill to talk about managing this. Thanks, guys.
So bringing us home here, we've got business modeling, we've got entity, we've got capital, we've got operational relationships. Now, as you can probably see, we have to worry about managing some risks here, okay? So first thing to think about is you probably, as I said, risky activities, put them in a limited liability company or a corporation. This will then create that separation between you and the business activities there. But in addition, get some insurance. Talk to a broker who will shop among different insurance companies for you. Definitely get some hefty insurance if you're doing anything risky. Now, another thing you think about is your agents, your employees, your volunteers, your interns. Make sure you control them kind of carefully because they can have interactions with customers. They can run over somebody with their car, different things like that. You have to make sure that you screen them, hire them, and supervise them very carefully there. Now, a part of managing the risk with them is indemnifying them. That means if, they were doing a delivery for you and then somebody stepped off the curb, well, if they weren't at fault, if they weren't drunk or something as they were driving, you want to indemnify them. You want to back them up. Actually, it's by state law required to back them up if they were acting within the scope of their duties there. And of course, your insurance helps to take care of that indemnification. Contracts is a good thing to use to shift liability with people. This particular wonderful building that we have here was probably built by general contractors, and then we guess that in that contract, the SBA had with that contractor had said, look, if something goes wrong, this light fixture falls on my head right now, probably the contractor is going to be responsible. And that was in the contract with them when they put this building together. Okay? Choose your activities carefully, avoid those risky activities if you can, And then I would just point out to you that what the law expects of people in the leadership of organizations are two duties. One is that you're going to act as a reasonably prudent leader of a business, a board member, or owner of a business, and that just means making sure that you follow your processes to make decisions on a regular basis. You follow your bylaws if you have a corporation about how to make decisions. You gather in information to help you make those decisions, but you don't have to be perfect. You know, it's just showing that you're following your own decision-making process set forth in your formative documents. And the duty of loyalty is another area people can get in trouble. That would be, excuse me, the expectation the law puts on leaders of businesses that they're going to put the business's interests ahead of their own personal interests. So that just means that a leader of a business, let's say a board member, can't rent to the entity without disclosing that they have an interest in the rental, maybe an office building that they have this extra space, and they'd say, oh, hey, our company could rent here, but they don't mention that it's their building. So duty of loyalty is such that you, again, have to put the company's interests before your own. Okay, and in each of those situations I was just talking about, if you don't act with some amount of care, if you don't disclose those personal interests, then you can lose your limited liability shield. All right, now we're in the home stretch, managing those risks. What about intellectual property? Look at all these people who are making intellectual property, independent contractors, founders, consultants, engineers, volunteers. They're making all this great intellectual property for ABC company, but people forget that you have to get them to assign their IP generally. If they're employees, the presumption is they already have assigned that. If there are any of these people here who aren't employees, you got to get that assignment in writing from those. And here are some of the intellectual property aspects you want to worry about: trade secrets, patents, copyrights, trademarks. IP by contract, these would be non-disclosure agreements, for example, creating confidential relationships by contract. I'm not going to go through all of this here. You can take a look at this yourself. But just so you know, trademarks and copyrights, these are things, and patents particularly, these are things that have to be assigned to the company through a contract of some sort. And we have a whole PowerPoint actually here to hand out for people that explains these different aspects of your assets that are intellectual property. Okay, finally, the extra permits, the licenses that are required for you to do your business. Well, first of all, a couple of things. What are governments going to care about with your business here? Why do I have to do these permits or registrations or stuff like that? Well, usually, your local county or your local city is going to want to know that you are in business in the county there. Sometimes they'll want a little business license fee from you, or even a little percentage of your annual income there. So you're going to have to file one of these things called a business license or doing business as form, sometimes called a fictitious business name form. You go to your local county, fill that out, pay a little fees, maybe it sets you up for an annual fee. That's something you absolutely have to do. Okay. Sometimes they'll also care about where you're doing your business. So you don't want to have like lots of customers coming through residential areas. You know, they might have you register as a home-based business if you're doing home-based stuff. Just make sure you talk to your landlord about it. Make sure you get that insurance. Make sure that a lot of customers aren't trooping through on a regular basis. And as I said, doing anything else beyond that, like doing food or doing, hazardous waste removal, things like that, probably going to need to get a permit for that. In addition, that's where this website is going to be very helpful for you, calgold.ca.gov. If you put in your business activity, it'll spit out the different state, local, federal forms, permits that you have to do. And the key thing there is, if you don't have one of those permits and it's a regulated activity and something goes wrong, a judge is generally going to find you automatically liable. It's called per se negligence not to have a permit when you were supposed to have it. Okay, so check that out. So here's our checklist again. This is modeling, entity formation, capitalization, operational relationships, managing those risks, and getting those extra permits and licenses. This is going to help you get out on the road and be a survivor, one of those businesses, 50% of businesses that still sustain after 5 years. So we want to get you out on the road, being happy here. This is our contact information. We do regular office hours, Monday and Wednesdays from 11 to 2. You can call in, you can web in. We'll give you 45 minutes of free talk with a lawyer if you can't afford one. We also are down here on a regular basis to do workshops on Merced, on Modesto, and First Friday, and then down here in Fresno here at the SBA and Hispanic Chamber in the afternoon on third Fridays. So looking forward to talking with you. Looking forward to getting you out on the road and protected and safe in your business. And good luck to you in the future.